As the movie begins, we're introduced to Will Hunting, a young man reading a book within the confines of his house. Despite his exceptional intellect, Will works as a janitor at MIT and lives in an underprivileged neighborhood in South Boston. As a mistreated foster child, he unconsciously blames himself for his unfortunate past and uses this self-hatred to sabotage his own life. The scene then shifts to MIT, where Professor Gerald Lambote is teaching a mathematics class. After the lecture, Gerald informs the class that he's posted a problem on the notice board, and the person to solve it will have their name published in the MIT Tech newsletter. After the students leave, Will notices the math problem left by Professor Gerald. Later, he and his friend Chucky head to a bar and hang out with their other friends. However, Will leaves the pub early and works on the problem he noticed earlier. The next day, Will writes the solution to the math question on the board. While watching baseball with his friends, Will notices a guy who used to bully him in school. He then approaches the bully with his friends and starts fighting. Soon enough, the police show up to detain him, but Will attacks a police officer in rage, resulting in his arrest. Meanwhile, Gerald is taken aback to see the solution displayed on the board. He asks the students if they solved it, but no one comes forward. After that, Gerald informs them that he's written another math problem that's taken him 2 years to solve. Later, Will's released from jail, and when he returns to work, he immediately sets out to solve the problem on the board. Just then, Gerald catches him and suspects Will is vandalizing the board, so he chases him away. After Will leaves, Gerald looks at the board and sees that Will has actually solved the problem and realizes that he's a genius. That evening, Will informs his friends that he's been fired from his job, and they all head to a bar. There, Chucky flirts with a beautiful Harvard student named Skylar and lies about having a history class with her. Moments later, a man named Clark shows up and starts to insult Chucky by showing off his knowledge of history. Chucky, not being a history student, remains silent. However, Will jumps to Chucky's defense and matches Clark's knowledge with historical facts he's studied. He even mocks Clark for spending thousands of dollars on schooling that he got for free at a public library. A few moments later, as Will prepares to leave, Skylar approaches him and hands him her phone number, suggesting they go out for drinks sometime. Meanwhile, Gerald inquires about Will and discovers that he got the janitor position through his parole officer. Later, he appears at Will's court hearing regarding the scuffle with cops a few days earlier. Will defends himself, but the judge informs him that he has a long history of stealing and assaults. The court says he can't turn a blind eye to what Will has done and sentences him to jail with a bond of $50,000. Next, Gerald visits Will in jail and informs him that the judges agreed to release him under his supervision, but Will must agree to 2 conditions. First, he must study mathematics with Gerald, and second, he must consult with a counselor to help him deal with his anger and defensive personality. Having no other choice, Will agrees to these terms, although he believes that he doesn't require therapy. Soon after, Will begins taking mathematics classes with Professor Gerald, who's very impressed with Will's ability. In the meantime, Will meets many therapists, but finds it difficult to open up to them. Throughout the counseling, he continues to dismiss and mock them. As a last resort, Professor Gerald seeks help from his old friend, Sean McGuire, who now teaches psychology at a community college. In their first therapy session, Will and Sean begin by discussing books and art. Will makes fun of Sean's book collections and paintings, but Sean understands that this is his defensive mechanism, so he stays calm. Will realizes that Sean no longer has a wife and speculates that he may have married the wrong woman. He then asks Sean whether his wife left him for another man. In response, Sean clutches his throat and orders him not to insult his wife again. After Will walks out, Gerald enters, convinced that Will has ruined his chances with another therapist. However, Sean sees Will as a challenge and asks Gerald to bring him back again. Later, Will and Skylar spend time together, and she shares about her schooling and elite family, as well as her plans to study medicine at Stanford after graduating. The two hit it off right away, and at the end of their first date, they kiss each other. In the following scene, Will arrives for his next session, and Sean brings him to the park. Sean informs him that he stayed up all night thinking about Will's comments on his painting, and he realized Will is just a child who doesn't know what he's talking about. He's read books, but has no actual experience and has never traveled outside of Boston. While talking, Sean mentions his wife dying due to cancer. And that evening, Will calls Skylar from a payphone while it's pouring heavily. She answers, but Will lacks the nerve to say anything, so he simply ends the call. Days later, on their third therapy session, Will and Sean don't say anything to each other until the session ends. During their fourth session, Sean is almost asleep when suddenly Will begins speaking. He tells Sean about Skylar and how he hasn't spoken to her since their first date. When Sean asks him why, Will responds that he believes Skylar's too good for him. Hearing this, Sean calls him an amateur and reminds him that he isn't perfect, nor is Skylar. They simply need to figure out if they're perfect for each other, and the only way to find out is to give it a shot. Encouraged by this, Will visits Skylar's dorm and apologizes for not calling her. He then invites her out again, but Skylar says she has a really complex problem that will take her hours or perhaps days to solve. Will then quickly goes and returns with the answer to her task, stating that he can't wait until later to spend time with her. They then go to a dog race together, in which Skylar's dog also competes and wins. Later, when Skylar asks Will about his family, he lies to her and claims that he has 12 brothers. In the next scene, Will attends his next therapy session and asks Sean whether he regrets meeting his wife because of the pain that he's now experiencing. Sean believes that everything has positive and negative aspects. Will asks Sean when he knew she was the one for him, and Sean responds with a date, proving how well he remembers everything. They met during a baseball game, and Sean recalls the highlights of the event. However, he later admits he wasn't even there to watch the entire game because he was spending time with his future wife. Sean states that he has no regrets about meeting his wife and having her in his life, even if it was only for a few years. Later, Will decides to bring Skylar out for a drink with his friends, and they all get along well. However, Skylar's upset that she hasn't visited his home or met his family, so Will promises to introduce her to his family soon. The next day, Gerald meets Sean to talk about Will's progress. He thinks that Sean should talk to Will about his future because he has a lot of employment offers that match his potential. Sean responds that Will's gradually begun to open up, but he'll require more time. But Gerald admits that it's too late because Will has already gone to a job interview. However, it turns out that Will has sent Chucky in his place. During the interview, we see Chucky behaving rather casually, leaving the people of the company confused. Meanwhile, Will is with Skylar, who asks him to come to California with her. He panics and tells her he can't go because he works here. Skylar asks why he's hesitant to commit to her and why he refuses to tell her the truth. She mentions how Will lied to her about having 12 brothers, but hearing this, Will gets angry and informs her that he was an orphan who spent most of his childhood being molested by foster parents. Realizing that he needs some nurturing in his life, Skylar tells him that she loves him, but Will claims that he doesn't care about her and walks out of the room. Later, Gerald and Will talk about a mathematical formula. He gets enraged when he finds out that Will didn't attend the meeting he planned. Will boasts about how simple his task is, while Gerald struggles to solve it. At this point, Gerald regretfully realizes that Will has greater potential than him, but he's so unhappy that he just tosses it all away. The next day, Will goes to meet with the National Security Agency to do an interview. They try to persuade him to take a position there, but Will says that if he cracks a code that allows the government to bomb a civilian town someplace in the Middle East, that's his fault. During another therapy session, Sean asks Will how he plans to earn a living. In response, Will tells him that he'll spend the rest of his life as a construction worker in Boston. Sean confronts Will about his fear of leaving his comfort zone and how it prevents him from living his best life. At this point, Sean has had enough of Will's immaturity and urges him to leave because Will seems to have an answer for every question except how to live his own life. Afterward, Will calls Skylar to say goodbye before she leaves for California. Skylar tells Will that she loves him in the hopes of reuniting with him. However, Will just smiles since he lacks the courage to say it back to her for fear of breaking his heart. The following day, Gerald arrives at Sean's office and, upon discovering that Will isn't there, warns Sean that if he files a report claiming that he's not present, he'll be arrested. Sean and Gerald then get into a disagreement about Will. Sean defends the man by claiming that Will's been emotionally wounded by his fear of abandonment his entire life. He's irritated because Gerald only wants him to study mathematics. They yell and detest one another violently, and Gerald even accuses Sean of being jealous of his success. Just then, Will walks in and hears their conversation, causing Gerald to leave. Following this, Sean opens Will's evaluation file and discovers that his foster father used to abuse him. Sean then confesses that his father was also an alcoholic who abused him and his mother. Hearing this story, Will starts to recall the torture of his foster father. Then Sean approaches Will and informs him that whatever happened to him was not his fault. Will eventually breaks down in tears and hugs his therapist emotionally. And finally, Will tells him that he's ready to let go of the past and move on with his life. Days later, Will decides to take one of the jobs set up by Professor Gerald. When Sean asks him if that's what he wants to do with his life, Will responds yes. This concludes his final therapy session with Sean. Will asks him whether he can contact him again, and Sean responds that he's always there for him and encourages him to follow his heart. A few days later, Will receives a car as a gift for his 21st birthday. The car isn't brand new, but he appreciates it since it's a gift from his best friends. Then Gerald visits Sean, where they both apologize to each other and work over their differences. Sean informs him that he'll take a break from work and go traveling for a while. Later, while Sean's packing his belongings, Will leaves a message in his mailbox and walks away. In the next scene, Chucky rushes to Will's home but finds him missing. He then smiles as he realizes Will's finally made up his mind about what he wants to do with his life. On the other hand, Sean receives Will's letter in which he states that he's not taking the job, but is going to California to meet Skylar. Sean's also happy for Will and returns to his home. The movie then concludes with Will leaving South Boston for the first time in his life to be with Skylar in California.